So the Supreme Court recently issued an order in the critical Second Amendment Preservation Act challenge that was pending in front of them. So let's talk about what happened and where this case goes from here. Now, before we jump into this video, if you guys want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe. Also, double check to make sure YouTube has not unsubscribed you. Every single time I mention that, people write in the comment section that they thought they were subscribed or they were, but then they've been unsubscribed. So just double check that to make sure. I also want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is 1st Phorm. You guys know that 1st Phorm's an amazing company. Their culture is unmatched. They're pro-freedom, pro-America. They support the Second Amendment and what we talk about here on the channel. Plus, they have amazing supplements. So check them out using the links down below. And also, if you order something over $100, you can get free shipping on that order, and they also have a money-back guarantee. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be talking about a significant and critical Second Amendment protection case that was seeking Supreme Court emergency review. This case deals with a state's Second Amendment Preservation Act, or a SAPA law, and we've discussed this case in the past because in the past, the Supreme Court issued an 8-1 order denying a stay which would have protected Missouri's SAPA law. This case went back in front of the Supreme Court, and we recently got an answer from the court. The Supreme Court, in a recent order list, denied emergency review to this case and did not overturn what the lower court said about Missouri's SAPA law. However, I will note that this case is not done yet and it's far from over. Now, you might remember that in this case, the Trump administration continued to argue that the Missouri SAPA law is invalid in some of its applications and that the Supreme Court should deny review to the case. However, at the same time, they also mentioned to the Supreme Court that if the court denied review to this case and the government got this back down in the lower court, the government then would release some of the judgment that they received prior in this case. The Trump administration told the Supreme Court once this case got back in the hands of the district court, they would release part of the judgment that the Biden administration got against Missouri. Missouri responded by pointing out that that concession made by the Trump DOJ is exactly why the Supreme Court should have granted review to the case. However, unfortunately, the Supreme Court, like I mentioned, decided to issue an order denying review to this case. Now, this lawsuit revolves around the 2021 Second Amendment Preservation Act that was passed in the state of Missouri. That law set the state's interpretation of the Second Amendment and set the restrictions on the support and funding that the state would provide to federal agencies in their attempts to enforce federal laws that violate the Second Amendment. The law prohibits Missouri's officers, agents, and government officials from helping federal agents who are attempting to enforce those inconsistent two-way laws. The law also created a civil remedy where anyone could sue Missouri officials if they help to enforce a federal law that violates the Second Amendment. So the law aimed to give the true enforcement powers to the citizens and the residents there in Missouri instead of the state or any of its officers or agents. In this Missouri case, the district court on review ruled in favor of the then Biden administration, striking down the Missouri SAPA law entirely. In response to that, the state of Missouri then appealed up to the circuit court. Missouri at that time wanted a temporary stay of the lower court's ruling, which was denied, and that led them to seek emergency Supreme Court review. However, on review, the Supreme Court issued an 8-1 order denying that stay request. Only Justice Thomas was in favor of granting Missouri's request for the stay, which would allow them to implement the SAPA law. Now, after the Supreme Court denial, the circuit court then got to re-review the case. They held expedited hearings and arguments in the case, and then the circuit court ultimately ruled in favor of the federal government, striking down the SAPA law once again entirely. But then again, like I mentioned, that led Missouri for the second time to go to the Supreme Court, seek a Supreme Court cert and emergency intervention in this case. Now, one of the big things that Missouri pointed out is that the circuit court essentially said that the structure and operation of this law is potentially valid, but ultimately it was struck down because the circuit court did not like the underlying Second Amendment purpose. They did not like that this was aimed to preserving the Second Amendment. Missouri argued that the circuit court went against clear precedent and found that the state officials could be sued because the court believed that the state played a role in enforcing the law by simply complying with the law in the way that it was written. Essentially, the circuit court found that compliance here amounted to simply non-action and non-enforcement, and then that actually meant that they were enforcing the law. So simple non-enforcement was actual enforcement. Now, this law was originally opposed by the Biden administration, but now the Trump administration has controlled the case. And initially they stalled their response out for multiple months, but then we received their answer. And in that response to the Supreme Court, the Trump administration continued to argue that some of the SAPA law is invalid and that the lower court got the decision correct. However, at the same time, like I mentioned, they argued that if the Supreme Court denied review to this case and it got back in the hands of the district court, the federal government would ultimately dismiss some of the judgment that was won by the Biden administration. Here, the Trump administration believed that the court went too far, that the lower court giving them an entire injunction against all of the SAPA law and all of its enforcement mechanisms went too far, and so they stated that they would release some of that judgment. The Trump administration argued that having reevaluated this case, the United States has concerns about whether the judgment below extends too far and enjoins applications of the act that do constitute mere non-enforcement of federal law protected under the anti-commandeering doctrine. And those concerns are exacerbated by the uncertainty in this pre-enforcement posture about how certain provisions of the act will be applied and about whether the provisions on which the Eighth Circuit focused is indeed inseparable from the rest of the act. They stated that given these concerns, the United States has decided that it would acquiesce in narrowing the scope of the judgment when the district court regains jurisdiction over this case. So after stalling for multiple months, the Trump DOJ responded in the Supreme Court by saying that some of the SAPA law may be invalid, but maybe some of it is not. And so when it gets in the hands of the district court, they're going to release some of the judgment and maybe allow some of the SAPA law to go in place. And like I mentioned, unfortunately, the Supreme Court sided with the Trump administration in this case, and they issued that recent order denying review to the SAPA challenge. Now, despite that denial, this case is not yet done. It's far from over, and it's still going to move forward. As the U.S. stated that in their request to the Supreme Court, requesting denial of this case, they said that if it got back in the hands of the district court, they're going to be releasing the total preliminary injunction that was issued by the district court against the Missouri SAPA law. So there may be some ways in which now that this gets back in the hands of the lower court will be forced to release some of that judgment. It's really potentially not up to them. The DOJ will say that they want to release that. I guess the lower court can get in the way really if they wanted to, but then that would get appealed and, would kind of start this whole process over again. But ultimately, if the Trump DOJ releases some of that judgment, well, then that's on Missouri to figure out what aspects of the SAPA law they can start to put in place. So even though the Supreme Court denied emergency review to this case, it will move forward in the lower court, and the Supreme Court will send this back down to the Western District of Missouri, and the court there will have to review what the United States government says about releasing some of the judgment and see how that plays out. But again, that opens the door for some of this SAPA law to go into place and really see, how does this non-enforcement aspect of the SAPA law really play out. We will now see if the Trump administration stays true to their word or if they're going to go back on that promise and go back on the statements that they made at the Supreme Court level when they were seeking denial of this review. So unfortunately, the Supreme Court once again denied review to a case and denied getting involved at this emergency basis. But there is still hope and positive movement in favor of keeping the Missouri SAPA law in place in some ways. But again, this is not a final merits judgment yet. This is going to go to full litigation at the lower court level. And then also we'll see how does this play out. I would assume that the district court would still say that all of SAPA law on the final merits is invalid. But it seems like the Trump DOJ wants to see how some of this aspect of the SAPA law plays out once there is some sort of enforcement mechanism that is allowed by the state. So that's what's happening in this critical Second Amendment Preservation Act case that was denied review by the Supreme Court. It's now going to go in the hands of the lower court. The Trump DOJ says that they're going to release some of the judgment and maybe some aspects of the SAPA law will potentially go into effect. And then we're going to see how does that play out from there. So as we get more information, as it develops more, I will let you guys know. Also, if you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, you can check out one of these two videos here on the screen that the YouTube algorithm thinks that you'll find helpful. But as always, thank you guys so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.